Welcome back to Real Estate No Dumb Questions. I'm Leah and this is Ella, and today we wanted to take some time to answer some rapid fire questions that have been coming our way. Starting with, what is a title search? A title search is essentially an examination of public records to determine who the owner of the property is and what claims are currently tied to the property, such as a mortgage lien. What is an easement? An easement grants someone the right to access someone else's property. So there are a couple different types of easements. There are road easements. In certain areas, maybe someone has to share their driveway with one or two or three different neighbors. So there might be an easement in place allowing access for all the neighbors, maybe it's in a cul-de-sac, to access that private road to enter their properties. There's other types of easements as well, like utilities, a phone line easement. Maybe there's different utility lines running over the property or under the property. An easement grants someone access to legally enter someone else's property. What is a home inspection? A home inspection is a visual assessment done by a licensed professional. And typically what these home inspectors are looking for are safety hazards around the house and also inspecting the physical condition of the property. So what does being under contract mean? Being under contract essentially means that the seller and the buyer have agreed to terms to sell and purchase a property. So when they're under contract, the buyer has put an offer in front of that seller to purchase their home, and the seller has accepted that offer. It does not mean that all is said and done. It simply just means that they have agreed to those terms, and now any possible contingencies that are a part of the contract need to be met in order to close the transaction. What is a contingency? A contingency is a condition that must be met in order for the property to be sold. So there's a couple different types of contingencies. There's the appraisal contingency, a financing contingency, a home inspection contingency, and there's also a home sale contingencies. When there's an appraisal contingency, for example, this means that the sale depends upon that appraisal coming back at a value that the buyer is comfortable with. If that appraisal comes back and shows that the property is worth less than what the buyer is purchasing it for, then because there's a contingency in place, the buyer could go back to the seller and say, hey, per the appraisal, the home is not worth what I agreed to pay you for it. Would you be willing to lower the sales price to match the appraisal? Another common contingency, like I said, would be a home sale contingency. So sometimes someone who is already a homeowner, they now want to buy a new home and sell the one that they're currently living in. So a home sale contingency would protect them in the sense that their new purchase depends on the success of them selling their current home. Contingencies are meant to protect buyers and sellers from various things that can happen during a real estate transaction. How long does it take to close on a home? So this answer just varies between different buyers. It can depend on the jurisdiction you're purchasing in and just based on your personal circumstances. But generally speaking, if you are taking out a standard residential loan in order to purchase your property, and if everything gets through underwriting with the buyer's lender fairly quickly, I would say it could take up to 30 days to purchase the property. But again, that can vary. Sometimes it takes up to 45 days, and in some circumstances where things are a bit more complicated, it could take up to 60 days. What is the difference between a selling agent and a listing agent? So this might seem confusing at first, but bear with me. The selling agent is the buyer's agent. The listing agent is the seller's agent. But essentially, whatever agent is working with the seller to list their home for sale, that is the listing agent. That is the agent that represents the seller. That agent is negotiating on their behalf and is working in the interest of the seller. Whereas the selling agent, and again, that's the buyer's agent, the selling agent is there to represent the interests of the buyer. So you've got your listing agent looking out for the seller's interests, and then you have your selling agent who is there to look out for the buyer's interest. What is an appraisal? An appraisal is an unbiased professional evaluation of the home's value. Typically, an appraisal is done when a buyer is working with a lender, and it's often the lender requiring the buyer to pay for an appraisal on the home. The reason for this is because the lender is lending their money to the buyer in order for them to be able to purchase the home, and the lender wants to know that the value of the home is the same, or at least in the same ballpark as the purchase price. An appraisal is good for a buyer to have because it shows them whether or not they're paying a fair price for their home. Typically, the appraiser is looking at the physical condition of the property, the outside, the inside, and making note of anything that might not be working within the home. If the stairs don't have a railing, that might be a safety hazard. They might note things like that on the appraisal. And the appraiser is also looking at similar properties in that neighborhood, or maybe a neighborhood over, to give some comparable prices of those particular properties in comparison to the home that the buyer is purchasing. What does escrow mean in real estate? Well, I'll talk to you about what escrow means, at least for a title company. As you know, I work for a title company, and we do both the title and the escrow for our transactions. So what does that mean from a title perspective? Escrow simply means that we are authorized as an approved third party to hold the funds that are pertinent to the transaction until that transaction is complete. So it's simply us holding those funds until the transaction is closed, which then gives us the authority to release those funds to the appropriate parties. For example, the seller. The seller is selling a home. They're supposed to get money for the most part. So whenever the transaction is complete, we would release those funds sitting in our escrow account to the seller to complete that part of the transaction. An agent, real estate agents, they need to be paid their commission after the transaction is closed. So those funds would also come out of the escrow account that we have to pay those agents, again, after the transaction is officially closed. What is a title defect? So a title defect is a discrepancy or an error that can come up that can make it difficult to transfer the property from the seller to the buyer. Defects can include liens against the title, such as an unreleased mortgage from a prior owner. Perhaps that mortgage was paid off when that owner sold the property, but somewhere on the back end, that mortgage wasn't officially released from the property and it's still showing as a lien of record. That would be considered a title defect. Another example of a title defect would be an error in the public records. Maybe the current seller took title with his or her name misspelled. Happens all the time. It shouldn't, but it does happen all the time. Another example of a title defect could also be a boundary dispute between two neighbors. What is a deed? So I often tell people when I'm doing their closing that the deed is quite literally their title. It is a piece of paper that shows you who the owner of the property is, who was the owner of the property before that owner, so it shows who transferred it to who. It'll show the date of that transfer, and then it also includes the tenancy in title, how they took the title. It also includes the legal description prepared by the attorneys. And the deed will go on record with the jurisdiction that the property is located in so that it is considered official and it's on public record.